to the Distinguished Archaeology and Archaeologist series that we've been running since Tom Lennon a couple decades ago got this started. We very much appreciate his support of it and the BCRN, Western Cultural Research Management. So Kathy Cameron will introduce the speaker.
All right. Thanks, Jason. I want to start out by letting you know there's a reception upstairs on the 4th floor afterwards, so don't miss that. Just come on upstairs after we're done here, and there'll be food and all sorts of good stuff. So, our speaker today is Dr. Ken Sassaman. He is the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Professor of Florida Archaeology. So that's a bit of a mouthful. At the University of Florida in Gainesville. He received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 1991, and there's lots of connections with Amherst that you've no doubt heard about. He joined the University of Florida in 1998. He works in the American Southeast, and his time period is archaic and woodland, and so you'll hear about that this week while he's here. He's conducted field work in a number of places: Savannah River Valley of Georgia and South Carolina, St. John's River Valley of Florida, and then most recently in the lower Swanee, that's how you say that, Valley of Florida. He is widely published. He's reported extensively on his field work and his theoretical work as well. He's the author of more than 20 books and dozens of articles and book chapters. He's been published in the Cambridge Journal of Archaeology, the Journal of Archaeological Research, and my favorite, the Journal of Archaeological Method. His 2008 book, People of the Shoals, Stallings Culture of the Savannah River Valley, won the James Moody Award, so he's an award-winning author. In addition to his extensive scholarly work, Dr. Sassaman also provides significant service to our profession. He is currently, and this should be of interest to any of you who are interested in publishing, he's currently the editor of our flagship journal, American Antiquity. So if you have questions about publishing something in American Antiquity, he's the guy to ask. So I'll let him get going. The title of his talk today is The Temporality of Ancient Experience, Archaeological Practice and Modern Living in the Human Challenges of Global Climate Change. So, thanks,
Thank you, Kathy. Well, thanks to everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure to be in Boulder. It's my first time. You have a beautiful place here. I don't know if I want to go back to Florida. You also have a remarkable building and remarkable staff and remarkable students. So congratulations for just a fabulous place here. Great environment for anthropology and archaeology. So tomorrow I'm going to talk extemporaneously from my PowerPoints about my case material. And my case material centers primarily on about 2,000 years of experience between about 5,000 and 3,000 years ago of dealing with relatively rapid and unrelenting sea level rise on the Gulf Coast of Florida, as well as the rest of the Gulf Coast, at least over to the Mississippi River Valley. So that's my case material mark, so that's the archaeological portion of the program. Today, I want to talk more conceptually and abstractly about some of the ideas to structure the way I think about this archaeology, and it's a little different. I'm not sure I believe it myself. I'm working on some new ideas. It's influenced by phenomenology, but it's also influenced by public policy, and especially influenced more so than anything else about this inevitable future, which is a future that's going to be a lot wetter, at least in the Gulf Coastal area, than it is today. We certainly have a major crisis afoot with climate change and sea level rise that I'm afraid that us smart Western civilized people haven't quite confronted or are able to deal with yet. So the role of archaeology in this is certainly oblique. I'm not sure that it's going to be salient. I hope that it is. And as part of the argument that I want to try to make today is that we do have something to contribute to public policy for these long-term futures, but it's going to take some theoretical gymnastics to get there, and a lot of really good empirical data too. So it's not just about ideas, it's about making this happen. So for today, because this is abstract and experimental, I made a script. And I'm going to try to stick to it. It's about 30 minutes long, and then I'll interject a few comments along the way, but leave enough time for questions and answers at the end as well. Okay? Let me start my clock here afresh. Okay. Here we go. I cannot evade the irony that comes with traveling 5,400 feet above sea level to talk about sea level rise. Like the Sermon on the Mount, the messages I want to share today have an eschatological bent to them. But unlike those of Christian millennialism, the news is not good. We are indeed in for some big trouble. By the middle part of this century, the landscape of coastal dwelling will have changed drastically, and with it, the networks of interdependency that traverse land across the entire planet, even at 5,400 feet high. Parts of South Florida are already committed for inundation by the year 2050, although few residents would admit as much. Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale both experience monthly flooding with the high tides of each new moon. Add another 6 inches of rise to the 9 inches of the last century, and downtown Miami's subterranean infrastructure will be rendered worthless, well before its streets are permanently inundated. Seawalls will do no good. Miami, like most of Florida, sits on porous limestone. Barricade the coastline from rising water, and it will seep up from the ground. Short of raising the entire city on a platform above the water, Miami will have to be abandoned and its people and purposes relocated in the next half century. Bordered on the west by an Everglades that will itself be transformed into a marine ecosystem by the end of this century, Miami has limited nearby options for retreating to higher ground. South Florida is the most vulnerable location for sea level rise in North America when measured in affected population, and the most vulnerable worldwide when measured in total lost assets. Miami-Dade County government and various agencies are planning for interventions against sea level rise, but these center mostly on engineering solutions, such as pumping water down, not the resettlement of the 5.5 million people that inhabit the greater metropolitan area, the 8th largest urban population in the U.S. Seawalls and canals will not work much longer, and the immediate problems of occasional flooding, compromised subterranean infrastructure, and the salinization of drinking water are challenges of engineering for which billions of dollars will be spent in the coming years. Not much proactive aid is expected from lawmakers. You know this guy? He's actually flipped. He's up for re-election. He's all of a sudden become progressive, liberal, a friend of higher education, politics. Not much help is expected from politicians who not only don't believe global warming, but are beholden to the development of tourist economics of Florida, its fiscal backbone, and the same manifest destiny philosophy that motivated frontier expansion westward. Florida's history, after all, is predicated on wresting civilization from the wilds of nature, converting through ditching and draining wetlands into inhabitable land. This has gone back a couple thousand years with the Calusa. There are canals connecting up the east and west coast of the south part of the peninsula. Development in South Florida may be the epitome of capital excess, of the hubris of the colonial-minded. Will the next iteration of development be literally the raising of Miami above the water, a technological frontier that may prove as challenging, or more challenging, as the colonization of space? The only reasonable course of action, according to University of Miami geologist Harold Wandless, is to curtail the public subsidies of coastal development and implement policy to induce resettlement of people to higher ground. I'm no expert on impending doom, but I believe he is correct. And some of you, those of you under 40, will live through this and see how far the effects ripple beyond Florida. Under some scenarios, the fate of Miami is duplicated elsewhere in the U.S. and certainly across the globe with only modest increases in sea level. Unlike Miami, many such places may find it feasible to defend against flooding with levees, canals, and other infrastructure, although in many cases access to fresh water will challenge defense in place, adding to economic projections that will eclipse the cost of all international conflicts over the past century. What role, if any, does archaeology have in this uncertain future? Many smart people would say none. And why should it? As a science of the past, archaeology is not expected nor prepared to deal with the challenges of today and tomorrow. Archaeologists certainly have good perspective on the long term, but the long term of the past, not the future. Beyond this epistemological constraint, there are many other reasons why people charged with public planning do not commonly consult the deep past for inspiration moving forward. It's hard to deny the incommensurability between the material world of the ancient past and a city like Miami. There are arguably no parallels among the ancients for the concrete, asphalt, metal, plastic, sewage, and human density of modern cities. But does this material incommensurability between then and now render the experiences of the ancients entirely irrelevant to our own futures? If we focus only on the physical challenges of sea level rise, the answer to this question is an emphatic yes. But if we instead shift our focus to the social and cultural dimensions of the problem of climate change, beyond its physical constraints, we find some hope that experiences of those living through similar change long ago provide guideposts for mobilizing social bodies into action, for intervening in uncertain futures. The potential I envision has to begin with a different sense of time than what we are used to as Westerners. The perception of a vast gulf between then and now begins with the notion of progress, the idea that somehow we have transcended the bounds of a thing called nature to take fate into our own hands through technology, engineering, and human ingenuity. It is the enlightenment of our history, our shared experience of distancing ourselves from nature by transforming it into something under our control, to encircle it, contain it, in a most perverse twist of logic, fetishize it as wilderness and preserve. In so doing, we render nature timeless, incapable of change until, that is, we change it ourselves. To the German theorist Ulrich Beck, modernity emerged at the point when we stopped worrying what nature would do to us and started to worry what we had done to nature. To him, those living before this uniquely Western transformation lived by fate alone. Beck's perspective resides in a modern sensibility that requires the construction of a primitive other in order to gauge the pace and direction of Western progress. There is a fundamental flaw in this perspective, and it is revealed quite simply by an archaeological record of ancient interventions. Examples in North America are many. Cahokia was an urban planning project. Chacoans recreated their world elsewhere when drought worsened. The Hohokam ordered a desert with miles of irrigation canals. Now-native Poverty Point in northeast Louisiana was erected in anticipation of abandoning the hub of a vast social network. The Calusa dug canals and ditches and built large platforms to make southwest Florida less vulnerable to flooding and more conducive to movement. And untold numbers of others terraformed their way into existence with architecture, impoundments, soil enhancement, and more. There truly are strong parallels between then and now in the sense that people have always constructed their worlds. Sure, incommensurability remains at many levels, but I hope we can all agree that what separates the moderns from the ancients is not the human capacity to intervene or to plan. No, what really matters here, beyond the physical scale of population infrastructure, is the temporality and anticipation of change, itself with scale and structure that is historically situated. So for instance, what appears to be parallel investments in the infrastructure of places of settlement vary less in physicality and more so in time scale. And by that, I do not mean simply the anticipated shelf life of a city or a seawall. Rather, the sense of time I mean turns on the notion that built into what appears to be permanence is impermanence, that what appears to be investments in present places are investments in future places. The terminology I need to make this case may defy difference, but that's okay, because it is the separation of the past from the future that is the biggest impediment to better futures for ourselves. I do not intend to make our ancients all modern, or to suggest that we have never been modern, but rather consider alternatives to the notion that permanence in place is the measure of success or of progress. My case study tomorrow would suggest that there were never any places of human construction that were expected to be permanent or unchanging, only places and matrices of change that enable time and space to be gauged for futures planning through movement, both human and non-human. Okay, what I'm going to do now is take this into 5 areas of interest that I think are nested hierarchically in a logical sequence. And they basically come like this. Talk about a new sense of time, or at least something that's not linear. It's not that it's new necessarily, just something that's unfamiliar to most Westerners. We think of time as being linear, irreversible, segmental. There's other ways of thinking about time, certainly. Go from there to the argument that we need a sensual archaeology. I know that sounds sexual, but I mean senses. That we need an archaeology that resonates with the human experience of the individual human bodies that we all know and love so well, right? Take that to the next level. That sensual experience needs to be translated into social experience. It's not psychology. It's not about the individual bodies, but the social bodies that share those experiences. Fourth, to translate those social bodies into place-based entities, which archaeologists do really well with. And then fifth, take our places and situate them into networks. And then maybe we can get to a point where we can start talking about having some relevance for policy moving forward. In a sense, in time work, my first point here. If a sense of time that is linear, irreversible, and segmentable is the biggest impediment to mobilizing the past for the future, then we may need to consider alternative temporalities. The chief problem here is a temporality that expects every future to be new, and thus every past to be annulled. Social theorists such as Bruno Latour and David Harvey have exposed the liabilities of this logic, and climate scientist Mike Holm has shown how it affects popular belief about climate change. Although time has seemingly natural qualities that can be measured, compared, and interpreted, it is in fact a cultural construction whose measurement, comparison, and interpretation are contingent on the complex totalities of situated human experience. Conceptions of time have always been central to the project of phenomenology, conceived as a study of conscious experience from the first person or subjective point of view, and later expanded to include the generative qualities of phenomena to experience, as in the meaning of events or the movement of time to one's sense of being. Time emerges from the hermeneutic circle of experience that enchains a chronological past, a lived present, and an anticipated future. And thus we can envision history not simply as the interpretation of past experiences, but rather past possibilities, what the German historian Reinhard Koselleck calls futures past. Koselleck devoted most of his career to the methodology of history, much of it geared towards the understanding that historical time cannot be reduced to natural time. The essence of this knowledge claim is that time itself cannot be intuited or perceived through sensory apparatus, but it is instead conceptualized through the metaphor of motion in space. There are thus many historical times, or layers to time, which then constitute the theoretical possibility of different historical accounts. Inherent to all human beings, according to Koselleck, is the space of experience, in which past things are present or can be remembered, and the horizon of expectation, in which the future is made present through anticipation. Each comes into play with the interpretation of any given event, but they never actually coincide. For Koselleck, the asymmetrical relationship between experience and expectation leads to new resolutions, and with it, historical time. An objective outcome of modernity and capitalism has been an acceleration of change, where every future is expected to have never before been experienced. For Koselleck, this new sense of time, what he called Neuzeit, emerged when expectations for the future distance themselves from all prior experience. As he and others have outlined, this outcome was hardly an unintended consequence of capitalism, but rather its intent. Koselleck has influenced me to think about archaeology not as the study of the past, but as the study of alternative futures. It begins by simply recognizing that how people imagine their futures is crucial to understanding their pasts. It likewise provides a perspective that reverses time's arrow to situate the past as futures past, and thus makes the past more relevant for our own horizons of expectation going forward. At face value, the logic here is not all that different from the logic of analogy, except that is in the direction of influence. For instance, in imagining how fast and at what magnitude sea level will rise over the next few centuries, geologists Andrea Dutton and Kurt Lambeck have developed data on the last time in the interglacial era parallel changes in climate since the end of the Pleistocene. It turns out that that was the last interglacial, some 125,000 years ago, when peak sea level was 5 to 6 meters higher than today, a level that would have involved the collapse of the East Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, one of the great uncertainties of climate change futures modeling, which is why the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has left that out of their projections because they really don't understand the physics of the sheet collapses well enough to give really good projections going forward. But these geologists looking at the last interglacial, they've been able to document that. They can see what the effect would look like, how fast it would come. They're working more closely on the metrics of it right now. Dutton and Lambeck are particularly interested in gauging how fast the ice sheets collapses away, projecting rates going forward. They have seen our future in this past record and are working towards greater resolution of these data in order to inform models for public planning. A 5 to 6 meter rise in sea would not only flood greater Miami, that would be 5 meters underwater, but also more than half of the inhabited coast of Florida and much of its peninsula. And as you well know, the vast majority of Florida residents live on the coast, the vast majority. Among other uncertainties, the inputs of industrial produced gases confound the utility of a 125,000-year-old future on projections going forward, just as the futures past of ancient people are rendered irrelevant to our own futures by the temporality of modernity. It follows that analogy, even homology, may not be enough to mobilize the past for the future. A more radical proposal, articulated best by Shannon Lee Doughty, is to deny the imposed linearity of time and allow past to be relocated to any present or future, free of values accruing from priority or progressiveness. Doughty notes this play of time in the modern subculture of steampunk or clockpunk, where Victorian meets the future. Her discourse on the ruins of modernity calls into question the value of an archaeology that prioritizes the past over the future. There is little recourse, she would argue, than to abandon the dominant temporality and allow historical time to be folded towards futures. And here she's inspired by the theorist Walter Benjamin, who's dealing with literary criticism and modern histories and so forth, certainly not an archaeologist. This is not a call for tradition or return to tradition or to a return to simpler times, but rather a radical call to repurpose archaeology, indeed, to get archaeology out of the heritage business. Peer critique of Doughty's papers in current anthropology and archaeological dialogues attest to a reluctance and skepticism among our colleagues for this radical makeover. Doughty explains in poignant terms how she came to understand the limits of conventional archaeology through the experience of Hurricane Katrina. Deployed by FEMA to assess the impact of cleanup efforts in the lower Ninth Ward, Doughty faced the unavoidable paradox between trying to preserve the past for an astonishingly uncertain future. As it physically marked the separation between culture and nature and between the order and chaos, the levee that separated the ward from the water symbolized the separation between the past and the future in the typical practice of mitigative archaeology. But just as the levee ruptured and just as the levee ruptured the divide between nature and culture, between order and chaos, Doughty is compelled to rupture the divide between past and future if the futures of the residents of Lower Ninth Ward were to be better off than in the recent past. The bodily experiences of those most directly impacted by Katrina have no equivalent in the virtual experience of those watching it on television with the disembodied statistics of severity and cost. From the perspective now nearly a decade later, Katrina, as an event, does not seem to have changed the horizon of expectation for those escaping the bodily experience of loss. Mobilizing an archaeology of alternative futures would thus need to reach people where it is actually felt, in the senses. Humans do not experience climate. They experience manifestations of climate that are more immediate, more local, than the global scale forcing variables that shape climate. Weather is perhaps a more apt interface between humans and climate, defined as a state of climate at any given time and place, and occurring at scales perceivable by humans in experiential time, those being subdiurnal and beyond, and in dimensions, rain, heat, darkness, wind, detectable by human sensory apparatus. The results of a recent study by Stanford researchers would appear to support the idea that sensual experience trumps all other forms of information input about climate change, even among well-educated, engaged people. As reported in The Guardian last November, the majority of American citizens now believe that climate change is real and want the government to do something about it. This is the finding of Stanford social psychologist John Krosnick, whose work reveals dramatic shifts in public attitude about climate change, even in historically conservative states like Texas and Oklahoma, where the majority of elected officials continue to deny it. Why the discrepancy? Krosnick attributes the shift not to better science or better public education on climate, nor to dramatic events like Katrina or Superstorm Sandy. The shift is instead attributed to personal experiences with changing climate, with the sensual experience of watching the soil shrink beneath one's feet, suffering the consequences of wells run dry, crops fail, cattle dead, the experiences that hit home the most. Seeing is believing. Residents of the coastal Alaskan villages of Kivalina and Newtok have watched their shorelines recede more rapidly in recent years, now at rates of loss that will require abandonment of their villages within a decade. An estimated 182 other native villages in Alaska are at imminent risk of inundation. Seeing is believing. Since 1984, mangrove has expanded in over 3,000 acres of habitat north of its historical limits on the Florida Atlantic coast. According to NASA and the USGS, the expansion is attributed to fewer extreme cold events in the region, a striking example of the effects of climate change occurring not as shifting averages, but in the frequency of rare events. For longtime denizens of the northern Florida Atlantic coast, the aggressive expansion of invasive vegetation is incontrovertible evidence that big changes are afoot. In these and untold numbers of other examples, the conscious recognition of climate change comes down to sensual experience, to seeing it, to feeling it, to living it. The relationship between the local manifestations of change and the global scale forces accounting for it are inconsequential to those impacted by change in their daily lives, and what we too often take for granted. It follows that if we are interested in helping to raise consciousness about impending change and the need to mitigate its adverse impacts, we have to find effective ways to connect the big picture of long-term processes and patterns to the scale of actual human experience. Consider, for example, the big picture of sea level rise since humans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere in the late Pleistocene. At the late glacial maximum of 20,000 years ago, sea level was down about 100 meters from its present level. Along coastal margins like the Gulf Coast of Florida, which has an extremely low elevational gradient, the transgression of rising sea yielded a net annual loss of 20 meters of shoreline, about the length of a football field every 5 years. But the rise in water and loss of shoreline did not unfold in geometric fashion. The rate and magnitude of change have both short and long-term variations and make it hard to generalize about the experience of change through time. If we are to follow the lead of our geology colleagues and see conditions in the past that are most comparable to those of the present and projected for the future, we may find more affinity with human experiences in the early Holocene than at any time since. The rate of sea level rise in the first millennium of the Holocene was over 1 meter per century, similar to conservative projections for the 21st century. At this rate, humans notice change in their lifetimes. They cannot help miss it. That we have been lulled into a false sense of stability in recent century owes as much to the subdued rate of climate change since the Little Ice Age, that is until the hockey stick of industrialization, as it does the cultural value placed on taming nature. But another relevant feature in the graph shown at the bottom left is the structure of change, whether it comes fast or slow, steady or intermittent, patterned or random. As we have seen, extreme weather events are not enough to sustain consciousness about risk and change if they occur too infrequently, beyond the scale of social memory, to make a difference. Our efforts to restore places and people to their pre-affected states only serves to erase memory, to lessen the gravity of the moment. And as a sidebar here, when Dottie made her recommendations to FEMA, they were to not to, basically bring it back and preserve the historic resources there. She wanted to enshrine it as it was, as a shrine of the victims of the institutionalized racism. You can imagine how well that went over with the federal government. It did. They deep sixed that report. You'll never see it. But she's happy to talk about it. She does it occasionally. Contrast the non-events of extreme events. By that I mean to erase the evidence of it. Remember the Amish murders years ago when that guy went to that classroom and killed those kids and the teacher? The Amish went and they razed the building, they plowed it under, and they completely erased the material evidence of that. It's kind of erasures that I'm talking about. Contrast the non-events of extreme events from which we can erase the material evidence of change with the enduring consequences of migrating mangrove forests. Short of eradicating the invading species, they stand as a constant moving reminder that climate is not static. All this goes to the need to explore the structure and rate of physical changes to determine how processes played out over long stretches of time, familiar to archaeologists, like we're used to dealing with these long stretches of time, these long sequences, how these intersect with the essential experience of people. Recent calls for an archaeology of the human senses and archaeology of human experience point us in the right direction. As Michelle Heckman has noted in a recent issue of SAA Archaeological Record, an archaeology of the human experience has the potential to inform contemporary and future challenges by developing empathy for the lives of those we investigate, and thus enable us to mobilize their experience at the scale at which public policy is implemented. Seeking greater empathy about our ancient informants is the key to erasing the divide between us and the other, to enhancing the relevance of ancient experience to our futures, and to striking a chord with a public eager to connect with the past. Southwestern U.S. specialists are at the vanguard of this new approach, providing insight on drought, terror, and immigration that resonates loudly with the greatest concerns of today. Those of us working outside the American Southwest are envious of the resolution and richness of the Southwest Archaeological Record. But I, for one, will not allow the limits of a lesser archaeological record to determine the questions of relevance or the scales of experience for which we seek insight. The time perspectivism Jeff Bailey has outlined is more an impediment to imagination than it is to science. Sure, the graininess of archaeological resolution offers insight at scales not accessible through written history, ethnography, or public surveys. But unless we are able to ratchet down the big picture to the little picture, we may find no entry into public policy and thus remain a profession of the has-been. However, before we overshoot the mark of greater empathy, we must step back and remember that experience that matters in public policy is experience that is shared at scales that qualify as social bodies capable of taking charge of their future, of planning for the long term. Experience that matters is social. How do you get tens of thousands of people to converge for a week in the hot, late August desert of Nevada to build a monument to self-expression and self-reliance? How? The answer is you do it every year, religiously. In any historical moment and social context, the connection between the space of experience and the rise of expectation is strongly conditioned by the periodicity and magnitude of events that people find memorable, such as tornadoes, droughts, economic recessions, political revolutions, presidential elections, Thanksgiving dinners, weekly masses, and yes, Burning Man. How experience gets encoded in things we might call tradition is a matter of social memory, memory that connects people across time and space to form communities of shared practice, and with that, the potential for mobilizing for futures. Again, archaeology in the American Southwest exemplifies a community-scale approach to the study of experience, showcased nicely in the work of many CU archaeologists, the Village Ecodynamics Project with Tim Kohler and colleagues, Margaret Nelson's resiliency work, and trans-regional initiatives such as the Global Human Ecodynamics Alliance, a diverse literature in archaeology dealing with communities of practice, landscape learning, coping with disasters, and more bears great relevance in connecting ancient experience to futures, starting with those born of experience. Here I'm inspired by Southwestern dendrochronologist who have strong insight in the structure and tempo of change or variation in climate as it affects social memory. And here I've been, I can't say that I have command of that literature very well, but there's a nice paper by Jeff Dean in a book on historical ecology looking at the structure of the magnitude and pace of change that you can read from Denver chronological records, as proxies for precipitation and overall climatic conditions of course. My own modest excursion into this sort of thinking is enabled by the historical record of tree rings developed by David Staley and others, an underutilized resource for modeling climate change in the Southeast over the past 2 millennia. If a drought occurred every 5 years like clockwork, who would not know about it and plan accordingly? And the converse, if droughts occurred unpredictably but averaged only 1 a century, who would know about it? And even if they did, why would they plan for it? Our tendency to classify these extremes as different sorts of environmental phenomena, the first pattern variation, the second random perturbation, obscures the value of both in understanding how experience gets encoded and mobilized for futures planning. We can model changes in the relationship between experience and expectation that would have affected the way climate events were perceived and acted upon. With data on objective conditions, like the proxies of tree rings, we calculate the space of experience, say at a generational scale of 20 years, adjust for the attrition of memory, and then characterize its central tendencies and variances over that time frame. We then look to see how well the experience of any given generation captures that of the preceding 2 generations, the range of time during which first-hand experience could be shared, word of mouth. Situations in which the space of experience of 3 generations, say 60 years, substantially reduces variance in objective conditions are those in which elderly members of society hold information valuable to future presence. When low-frequency variation such as this is structured in cycles of high amplitude, data on experiences going back several generations enables horizons of expectation to expand. It just so happens a little box here in the Middle Woodland period, my ancestralism up here in this little heuristic on the right here, is the Wheaton Island period of this incredible elaboration of ancestor veneration, when they dig up their ancestors and relocate them in other cemeteries, and they do this over a period of several hundred years. I don't think that that's a coincidental thing, although bridging these two is going to be quite a feat, I'm sure. Expectedly, the opposite situation, where you have high-frequency, low-amplitude variation, discourages deep-time perspectivism, and with it, less regard for the experiences of elderly members of society, which kind of characterizes our world today. When you go to your grandparents and ask them about the next generation of digital technology, and a few of them might know, but most of them probably don't have a clue about it. My dad still doesn't know how to turn on a computer. We have long been concerned as archaeologists how knowledge is encoded and passed on to subsequent generations. Yet, have we considered enough how knowledge about change gets encoded and transmitted? So much of it is, of course, inaccessible, beyond our reach, the stuff of oral history and performance. But so much of it is materialized in ways that are not beyond our reach, in the mnemonics of history, the shrines, the objects, the deposits, the orientations, and the dispositions of practice that connect people across time and space. Here then we arrive at the places from which people gain experience collectively, draw identity as a people, and plan for futures together. Archaeologists are especially good at thinking about places and landscapes, how communities come together to gather in certain places, how such places are connected through the movement of bodies and objects. I will return to the connectedness among communities in a moment, but first want to consider how, in their long-term histories, places provide the best opportunity for folding time, and thus for bypassing the usual criteria of analogy or homology. I started to think seriously about the transcendent qualities of place when a graduate student working with fishermen in Cedar Key, Florida, was questioned by her peers about the relevance of modern fishing to her understanding of ancient fishing. Cedar Key is a remarkable place, counted by tourists as a throwback to an earlier time, unchanged from its frontier beginnings. The image is apt in many respects, but beneath the veneer of modern timelessness is a storied past of boom and bust, growth and decay, political intrigue, and environmental disaster, all underlain by 4+ meters of Aboriginal deposits that enable the future possibility of a modern Cedar Key. When the town was relocated from one island to another after a devastating hurricane in 1896, it was not the first time, nor will it be the last, when a major settlement in the vicinity was displaced and re-emplaced because of high water. Affected communities differed across time in countless ways, spanning at least 4 millennia of change and turning decidedly in the Euro-American era. But they had this place in common. And this is not to suggest that the place did not vary. Quite the opposite. It's always changed. It is the common experience of time-sensitive physical and biological processes in this particular physical space that folds the ancient with the modern. In the sense of this place and its history of repeated interventions, the people of the 1st century AD, Native America, have more in common with modern Cedar Key residents than either has to do with people of common culture who occupied places of different character. There is something about these sea folk through time, we might say, that having dwelled in this place assured. If irrespective of genealogy or continuity, we were to allow the experiences of people in particular places to inform futures, then absolute time does not matter, and we are free to interdigitate historical narratives. Cedar Key's future has been played out repeatedly since the 4th millennium BP. It bears mentioning that the town of Cedar Key would have been flooded centuries ago had Native people not accumulated so much shallow earth on this main island. So this reconstruction by my former grad student, Asa Randall, from historic records and library data and so forth, all the brown and the grays there, all that topographic relief from this landform is anthropogenic. It's 4+ meters of accumulation, of midden. Some of it's mortuary, there's mounds that have mortuary components, and much of it is the accumulation of daily living over many, many, many centuries. The town wouldn't exist if that didn't happen. We wouldn't have this as an option if you're moving to that location. The study of place-based communities and their connections to the past is well established in archaeology. A related interest in the archaeology communities starts not in the past, but with contemporary communities and their own agenda for the future. These two related but yet to be integrated strands are a marriage waiting to happen. Moreover, a place-based approach to community resonates with policy initiatives to diffuse top-down directives and situate them at the scale of local agents in the places they value. So for instance, in 2009, the White House, under the Obama administration, issued a memo on fiscal planning that encourages the development of place-based economic investments. Hasn't gone anywhere, although you would think the Republicans would embrace that. Federal agencies such as the National Park Service have championed place-based learning as a way of promoting conservation and related environmental issues. The Center for the Study of Social Policy at the University of Chicago, established in '79 to address federal social welfare policy, has grown increasingly interested in state and local policy and now champions its own version of place-based initiatives. Organizations dedicated to the mission of place-based learning include the Center for Eco-Literacy in Berkeley, the Center for Place-Based Learning at Antioch University in New Hampshire, and the University of Vermont's Place-Based Landscape Analysis and Community Engagement Program. These and related initiatives open a door for archaeology communities that is policy relevant. As we focus more on places and the communities they foster, we must remain mindful that places are always parts of interconnected other places and the spaces in between. Indeed, the fastest growing communities in the world today are virtual, consisting of persons distributed across time and space and whose interactions take place primarily through digital communications technology. One might easily jump to the conclusion that any social movement predicated on modern technology finds no parallel in the past, the ancient past. But I'm curious to know how different really the distributed communities of the past may have been from those of today. Instead of digital communication, the distributed communities of the past were activated through movement of bodies, individual, social, even non-human. It follows that places on the landscape have relational qualities and thus could not be circumscribed spatially or culturally at any point in time by its membership alone. Sedentism and permanence is an illusion that material infrastructure fosters. Movement of bodies among places was always the way, and it still is. Well before there was Facebook, there was Placebook. And as I wrote that line, I said, well, I might as well Google this.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, there is a Placebook. Eastern European dudes came up with it, right? And it's just like a graphic version of where all your friends are and so forth. So there goes my cute little turn of a phrase. Oh well. In the study of networks, we again find archaeology well situated. Projects utilizing sourcing data on pottery, stone, and other media to trace movement of objects have been bolstered in recent years by bioassays on things like tooth enamel to trace the movement of actual human bodies. Patterns of migration, pilgrimage, raiding, slaving, and exchange are becoming increasingly clear, underscoring the dynamic and fluid nature of place-based communities and the links among them. Imagine now an archaeology of alternative futures that asks not how networks came into existence and function, but how they predisposed or even anticipated the movement of human and social bodies over time. Relatedly, can we reverse engineer a network as it exists at any point in time and project how people can be redistributed without undermining the fabric and capacity of its communities? Anthropologists like Tony Oliver Smith, who has studied displacement and resettlement for over 40 years, remind us that the greatest challenge in mitigating the disaster that disrupts place-based communities is reconstituting those communities in other places without meaning, let alone material resource. I have traversed a broad, shifting terrain in the last 41 minutes and 18 seconds. Our futures, as modern people who expect every future to be different because we ensure it, are uncertain because we have little experience dealing with changes we cannot control or at least cannot anticipate. I truly believe that archaeology can help to dislodge the Western mind from its own trappings, its uncertain futures. What I have outlined here is a 5-step program to greater relevance. It starts by considering alternatives to the linear time reckoning of the Western legacy, followed by 2, the centralization of the past, 3, socialization of central experience, 4, emplacement of the social, and 5, networking of the places. I cannot claim confidence that the program I have outlined here will resonate with the public or with policymakers, but I am sure that archaeology is conceived by mainstream strands of its profession, as well as most of its publics, will not be terribly useful to the challenges of our flooded futures, even at 5,400 feet above sea level. Thank you. Okay, so a little preview. So the case study tomorrow, the illustration on the left, I'll have to explain tomorrow with further graphics and plenty of time. But it's the outcome of 2,000 years of dealing with constant sea level rise, the most vulnerable place in North America, the Gulf Coast. And it's going to be an argument that there's a temporality of the people between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago that I think was scaled at the level of at least a century, maybe 2 centuries. They could not only incorporate the experiences of that much past, but project that much future forward because of the rate and magnitude of change being pretty predictable and repeated over these long stretches of time. Getting from here to flooded Miami and our own futures is the challenge that I don't know that I'm capable of stepping up to. I've talked to policymakers, and the usual response basically is, you gotta be kidding me, right? The challenges of relocating 5.5 million people out of Miami, a little bit more difficult than maybe 400 people off the Gulf Coast 2,000 years ago, with infrastructure that can be rebuilt in a few days, right? Certainly, it's a huge, huge problem. When you read the literature, I spent all Christmas reading the literature on Miami's future, and the people that are doing the scientific work and the people that are doing urban planning are on different pages. They really are working towards an engineering solution, but it is one that is going to have maybe a 20 to 40 year shelf life, and then it's going to be curtains. So this is a problem I think that archaeology can help to address, not by giving recommendations of how infrastructure would be relocated or anything like that, but trying to shift public attitude as well as scientific attitudes about the necessary time frame for futures planning. Is 20 years enough? That's what they're thinking right now. Is 50 years enough? That'd be great. They don't do that. 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, well. So it's one step by using these ancient paths where the temporalities perhaps were protracted out over much longer stretches of time than we're used to. It might help to shift the conversation a little bit in that direction. That's basically the step that I'm taking right now. We'll see if the rest can follow. I'll take questions if you have any.
Yes, sir. Sort of dovetails with what you were just saying. I'm very interested in what you're saying, and I think most archaeologists would agree that we need to move beyond the point of, hey, this site is cool, just for its own intrinsic sort of being a cool site.
It resonates with the public, though. I know why we have such cachet.
Mm-hmm.
We really do.
Yeah.
And we've been living off of it for a long time. I don't know this going to last.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've been reading up on this literature for the past few years, and there's a Charles Redman article, I think 2005, where he basically says the same thing that you're saying, in that archaeology, what we're doing is we can inform, or what we're learning can help us understand these climate changes that we're going through today. And I'm just wondering, all right, so that's 2005, that's 10 years ago.
10 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What
Jerry
progress has
Samuel.
there been? You know, it's where are we at, and where do you imagine us ultimately being in terms of?
Did you all just receive the latest issue of American Antiquity?
Mm-hmm.
So, Keith Kintig and a band of prominent archaeologists funded by NSF came up with the grand challenges, and they're incredible. I mean, the questions that are being asked and the relevance to the world is great. But I wrote in my editorial, this is the disconnect between doing that as archaeologists and parlaying that into public relevant information that can be mobilized. No one imagines how that's going to be done right now. I think if you've ever worked with public policy people, there's a pragmatism, of course, to it, and there's a short-term time frame associated with use, right? And then when you go beyond that, when you start, I was talking with Kathy about this before, when you start going beyond that, you're opening yourself up to being branded a social engineer or a propagandist, right? And so, you look at Nazi Germany, and they took archaeology to that level of basically fabricating a past that would justify a future. I'm not saying we're going to fabricate a past to justify a future, but I think what we got to do, the rupture between the past and the present that the Enlightenment created, and Western civilization has endorsed, capitalism has amplified, is our biggest impediment. So there's no reason why the experience 4,000 years ago isn't relevant for our future if we can get past the idea that those guys were just suckers living by fate alone. No, they took fate into their own hands. They engineered their way, they socialized their way, they cosmologized their way out of it. They thought through it, they figured out solutions, and they dealt with it. Their solutions are not our solutions, but their logic may be the logic, right? I don't know. Scott?
There's a concept I've heard about from economics called discounting the future.
Yeah, future discounting.
Yeah, so it's the idea that there's a decay in people's perceived value of things that are happening farther and farther out.
Yeah.
It seems to me like that's one of the key elements of human decision making that we need to try and work on, for...
And do you have a sense that that's historically specific to us capitalists, or is it something that's cognitively wired?
That's the first question, I think. To what extent does it vary across contexts? I don't know if any studies have been done. But I guess what your talk was getting me to think about is whether there's a connection between the rate of discounting the future and the degree of relationship you have with your past.
Yeah, that's what Costello would argue, that basically the horizon of the future is definitely predicated on the space of experience. If the space of experience, which has been our experience in the past, is that every future that we experience, every generation we have in the modern era is different than the previous generation, there's no reason to look back. And if it were the opposite, if you actually could go to your great-grandfather, you youngsters could go to your great-grandfather and great-grandmother and ask your great-grandparents what the next 50 years of climate's going to be like, and their knowledge was accurate, and that recurred century after century after century, we'd have a different sense of time with them completely. No, future discounting is this idea that I'll give you $10 now, or I'll give you $100 next year. You would? We need you in Washington. You look like you're ready to go now. So I'll vote with you. No, most people are going to say I'll take the 10 now because they don't know if it'll be around next year, a year from now. right? Future's discount. And so I think it's also the idea that, I mean, most of you guys have retirement plans if you have a job. But do you have a retirement plan for your children? No, that's supposed to be their responsibility, right? Or maybe your retirement is to make sure that they have a nest egg that they can start building their future. This may be a fool's errand, what I'm talking about here, but I am frustrated that I know that, as the geologists are doing, I know that there were pasts that have futures that are similar to the ones projected by good scientists for our own futures. So why aren't those futures past mobilized as experiences relevant for our own futures? Apart from the infrastructural differences, I think there's great relevance there. Just got to figure out how to frame it so that policymakers will pay attention. You know, there's always people in like government that'll listen, and there's people that have really savvy perspectives, and they'll understand what you're saying, and they'll understand that there's value in it. But ultimately, they have to implement it, or they have to figure out a way that will be, you know, policy relevant. And that's the big chasm I don't know how to cross. If any of you guys have any suggestions, I'm the table.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to supply a suggestion, but one thing I've been dealing with is in ancient Mesoamerican volcanically active areas, they developed a form of wattle and daub architecture that is one of the most seismically resistant kinds of architecture. But when the Spanish came in from the Iberian Peninsula, they didn't have experience with earthquakes. And they brought in unreinforced, sun-dried adobe bricks. And they portrayed the native kind of architecture as backward, and we are progress and bringing in civilization. And that has been so pervasive century after century, earthquake after earthquake. There was an earthquake in 1978, I think it was, when 23,000 people died in Guatemala from those adobe brick unreinforced walls falling in, and not one person from this wattle and daub. It's called Bajareke architecture. And we're trying to reintroduce it.
Yeah.
But we can't, we've only had success by not using the term Bajareke, because that's considered really backward. We've given it a new name, and so now people are starting to think, oh, you know, now this has a cachet.
Yeah. So that's good marketing, yeah.
Yeah, but it has to be defined differently.
So that's a great example. This is the things too that Redmond talked about, or Jerry Savaloff in his book, that there's real specific archaeological applications of ancient knowledge for modern problems, and that clearly is getting some traction. It's working. I think Clark Erickson had a project or at least for that kind of stuff. I don't know what it would be for Miami, but if you follow what I was saying, I know it's kind of turgid, but I basically would say if I was in charge of Miami right now, I would do a social study to figure out the social networks that exist in the city right now, and then start developing plans to relocate those people to places for which they have connections, existing connections, in places that have less vulnerability to sea level rise. Cuba is one of them. And people say, well, Cuba's going to be on where? No, Cuba's got high elevations, at least in the southeastern part of the island. And it's as big as Florida. And most of that's undeveloped. So granted, all political issues aside, if we could level the playing field politically and think about the expats that would go back to Cuba, if given the opportunity under the right conditions, that would take care of half the problem. Maybe not half the problem, but a quarter of the problem. Miami's a really cosmopolitan, diverse community or city that has many communities that are connected in many ways to other places in the world. Reverse engineering the social networks is what I was getting at. That's why I think that abandonment, we've talked about this in many archaeological contexts, that abandonment's never the end of anything, it's just the next step towards the future, right? That there's some other place to go to that's going to provide an alternative to conditions that are no longer viable in place. So that maybe there's one way of doing that. I can't even begin to figure out how to begin to just enter a problem of that complexity. Your examples are more, I think they're discrete enough that they can be developed and applied effectively. They're not going to solve this kind of problem necessarily. But maybe that's the first step, right? relocating. I mean, people were relocating pretty quickly on the coast by having architecture that could be dismantled and rebuilt. Northwest Coast groups could do this with plank architecture, right? They could dismantle a longhouse and reassemble it in a couple of days somewhere else. Usually that's under warfare, not environmental stress. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yeah, so North Miami is a lot like the Ninth Ward. What do you think this kind of perspective would do for North Miami?
It's a little higher elevation though, so it's an interesting reversal of topography. That part of the things that I read over the Christmas break were that if Miami's going to try to redistribute humans within the municipal spaces that they already have, the black communities, the lowest income communities are at the highest elevation. Unlike the lower Ninth Ward at the lowest elevation. That's true in Alexandria, Virginia too, where the freed slaves were basically put into the wetland environments and not a very good place to make a living. So it's reverse. What's going to happen is, real estate speculation. We're going to go through the same crap we went through after during the Jim Crow era, and we're going to see basically people being gypped out of their resource by offers too good to refuse, lose their property. Skyscrapers will go up when there's the North Miami area like that. People that talk about this stuff from a real estate point of view, they know damn well what's going to happen. It's not going to be the government saying time to leave. It's everybody leaving because the insurance companies are going to pull out. The next time there's a storm, it's not going to take a massive storm to flood Miami, but when they pull out once and for all, people that have real estate investments there will probably follow suit. I mean, I don't think they have any recourse. If somebody's holding a note on their property, they're going to have to. So, I don't know. You guys are going to. If you can think of alternatives here, I mean, it'd be nice to get this discussion rolling. It's not a discussion that's happening in Miami. They really are. They're really working. They're focused on the engineering aspect. They're going to drill holes down into the earth and pump seawater below the freshwater aquifer. Yes, sir.
So, if you look around the world and see the displacement of populations due to war and our inability to deal with 100 to 200,000 people, and we put them in tents for a while and then we forget about them, how is this going to work when you have millions of people who may be motivated by fear and not planning? So we could talk about planning and look in the future, and media these days just works off of fear.
Yeah.
And they keep the story going. So all you need is some trigger, some tipping point where populations just kind of go bananas, and then all of a sudden you have a displacement issue. And it may not be organized.
It's going to make any international conflict we've been in look like a walk in the park.
That's my point.
So the only thing I can comment is, again, repeat that if we can work with existing social networks and create inducements for relocating people now and not wait till disastrous events in 2040 or 2050, if we can create those inducements, and they would have to be tax incentives, I suppose, that you would give people like tax-free opportunities for developing real estate towards the interior of Florida, up in the highlands. Our highlands are 100 feet above sea level. But I think that I can imagine these possibilities, but I'm naive. I'm not a politician. I'm not a real estate developer. I'm not an insurance adjuster. I don't really understand the complexities of it. But I agree with you. I think that what I've seen in my lifetime is that people aren't motivated for massive structural changes until there's disasters that push them into that. And if we get to that point, we're all going to suffer from it because we're interconnected as a democracy. And it's going to affect you guys financially. You might be able to get some pretty good Cuban food up here later. But sorry, I didn't mean to make money of that. Oh, it's after 5, yeah. But thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, let's move them to Detroit. Let's repopulate
So
Detroit.
there's a good example of inducements that could work, right?
When Katrina happened, actually, affected New Orleans, the people who left and never returned, they actually redistributed themselves to the urban network of the United States.
Yeah.
So it's like, in a way, I see the population of Florida being larger than the event of Katrina, but that was the first reaction. And of course, New Orleans has been it's going to happen again for sure, and we are going to see the cycle again. And one thing that we are observing basically is the denial of risk. And as long as we can use our resource, we are going to keep using it because it keeps generating revenue. And until it stops generating revenue is when we are going to move. Can we go back to your first map, one of the first maps you had?
Sure.
Where everything is flooded, everything is very bad.
Where everything's flooded?
Yeah, the projection of it's about North America with everything and before the
You
planet.
mean the whole planet?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's an extreme, I just got, I ripped that
Something
off
of
the
North
internet.
America.
That's high levels,
Yeah,
that's,
no, that's
that's
correct.
60
That's
meters.
correct.
It hasn't been like that for millions of years.
Yeah. Okay, so like we see disaster here, but there are other people who are going to see opportunity.
Look at the Amazon.
But we are going to see, there are other people who are going to see opportunity here.
Yeah, sure.
So it's like, well, it's like we're going to have more beach.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, these are all the things that politicians take into consideration.
Sure.
Of course, and they are not going to move for any of what we say as academics. They are going to move depending on what the people who vote for them actually think.
I follow you 100%. I think, and the logic works within the logic of capitalism, but the temporality of capitalism still is too foreshortened in order to anticipate futures going out, say, a century. And why would you invest in something a century out as an entrepreneur, you know, as a venture capitalist, unless you really had like this long-term sense of your legacy, and it was going to stay in your family. You could see 3 generations out down your line. You want to invest for their wealth. So the logic applies, but the temporality of capitalism is, you know, it's the quarterly report, the political cycle, planned obsolescence, you know, that's built into things. I hope I didn't bring everybody down.
But
I'm sure I did.
we can keep talking about this upstairs where there's food.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.